Is the Passover story in Exodus 12 an example of blood atonement? Well, to be more specific, is this account of the spotless lambs that were being slain and their blood applied to the Hebrew doorpost, was that a foreshadowing of Jesus as the spotless Lamb of God who would take away the sin of the world? Well, because the New Testament develops a very close association between the death of Jesus and the Passover of Exodus 12, we read in 1 Corinthians, "For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed." The question then is this: was that Passover lamb an example of blood atonement? Is that relevant? Is what we're reading in Corinthians relevant to the larger story found in Exodus chapter 12? Well, listen, in my younger days, I would teach the account of the Passover lamb in Exodus 12 as a picture of Jesus and his atoning death for the sin of humanity. I would point out how the Israelites were to choose a lamb without defect, without spot or blemish, and then explain that this Passover lamb is a picture of the sinless Jesus, Jesus, the Lamb of God. I would then make the comparison that like the Passover lamb in Exodus 12, whose blood would save Hebrew from God's wrath, so Jesus' death as the Lamb of God and the shedding of his blood, he likewise would save humanity from God's wrath and judgment on sin. But there was just one small problem with that interpretation. It isn't true. The Passover of Exodus 12 is not an example of blood atonement. Oh, blood does play an important role in this story. The Israelites were to take some of the blood of the lamb and they were to smear that blood on the two doorposts and the lintel of their houses. And Exodus states this: "The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are." But this blood was not shed for sin, nor was it shed to appease God's wrath. The blood of the original Passover lamb was quite literally a sign of protection over certain houses within enemy territory. Again, reading from Exodus 12. "The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague will befall you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt." Passover saw the potential destruction of Israel at the hand of its own God. The blood on the doorpost and the lintel were a signal to the angelic killer to move past this house and enter another. And again, keep in mind, the blood of the Passover lamb was not shed for sin, nor was it shed to appease God's wrath. And more telling, and this is important, the annual Passover celebrations that would follow generation after generation were never destined to repeat the applying of the blood's lamb to the doorpost or lintel of any Hebrew home. The reason why the blood was never splattered again on the doorpost and the lintels should be obvious. The crisis that brought about this application of blood the first time was solved. So you ask, what was the original crisis? Well, Israel had become a slave within Egypt, and the current Pharaoh was trying to eliminate all of the Hebrews. And on the night of Passover, Israel was delivered from Egypt. The angelic killer, that is God's angelic killer, passed over their homes because of the blood that was applied to the doorpost. But the firstborn of every Egyptian household was slain because these homes had no blood applied. In the years that would follow, Israel would celebrate the Passover as a remembrance of what God had done for them. He had delivered the Hebrew people out of Egyptian bondage. The blood of the Passover lamb was not shed for sin, nor was it shed to appease God's wrath. The blood of the original Passover lamb was quite literally a sign of protection over certain houses within enemy territory. But wait, you say, did we not just read in 1 Corinthians that Paul compared Christ's death to Israel's Passover? Well, we did. This is what we read. For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. But we are only reading just one part of that 7th verse in the 5th chapter of 1 Corinthians. Here is the complete verse. Cleanse out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, as you really are unleavened. For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. What is Paul doing here? Well, what Paul is doing is comparing Jesus' crucifixion to the original Passover that we read in Exodus 12, but not in the way of blood atonement. What Paul is doing is drawing an analogy. He saw an analogy between the leaven that was not to be allowed in the Jewish homes during future Passover celebrations. We read in Exodus 12, "This day shall be for you a memorial day," that is the Passover. "It shall be for you a memorial day, and you shall keep it as a feast to the Lord. Throughout your generations, as a statute forever, you shall keep it as a feast. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall remove leaven out of your houses. For if anyone eats what is leavened from the first day until the 7th day, that person shall be cut off from Israel." What Paul is doing here is he's drawing upon the command to remove the leaven from every Hebrew home during Passover celebration. He is using this removal of leaven as an analogy when he was writing to the Corinthian church. He is telling the church body at Corinth to remove the leaven from their body. But you ask, what leaven? What is he talking about? Paul had been informed of a gross sexual immorality within the Corinthian church. This is what he wrote. "It is actually reported that there is sexual immorality among you, and of a kind that is not tolerated even among pagans. For a man has his father's wife, and you are arrogant. Ought you not rather to mourn? Let him who has done this be removed from you." A son was having sexual relations with his stepmother. And the Corinthian church should have been mournful over this grievous sin, but instead they were boasting about this immorality. And Paul tells them that this offender should be removed from the body. Paul then backs up this exhortation to remove this man from the body by using the analogy of removing leaven from the home during Passover celebration. Listen to what Paul tells them. "Your boasting is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? Cleanse out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, as you really are unleavened. For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. Let us therefore celebrate the festival not with the old leaven, the leaven of malice and evil, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth." Like the leaven that was to be removed from the homes, that is, the Hebrew homes during Passover celebration, this sinful son, who is compared as leaven, he was to be removed from the church body at Corinth. Passover of Exodus 12, my friends, is not about sin. The first Passover was about God's judgment against the polytheism of the Egyptians. They were being marked out by the absence of blood above their doors. And we read in Exodus 12 regarding the first Passover. In this manner you shall eat it, with your belt fastened, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. Here's what is important to note. Both the idolatrous Egyptians and the gods they served would be judged. God would send the angelic destroyer who would pass over any house with the sign of the blood. But that same destroyer would enter every home without the sign of the blood. The night of Passover, the Hebrew people were delivered from the Egyptians, but the Egyptians suffered great loss. They lost their firstborn. And in addition, and this is important to catch, the gods of Egypt, the pantheon of Egypt, they too suffered great loss in that they were exposed. They were shown to be powerless against Yahweh. The sovereign might of Yahweh was seen by all, not only by the Egyptians, and by the way, even the nations around Egypt. They were aware of this as well. But the gods in the heavens, that is the Elohim, they saw what Yahweh alone is sovereign over all, and they too suffered great loss. This is the point. The blood on the doorpost of the Passover in Exodus 12 was not an example of blood atonement. It was not dealing with atonement at all. The first Passover was about God's judgment against the polytheism of the Egyptians and the very gods they served. And as a result, by doing what God did, the nation of Hebrew, the Hebrew people themselves, were delivered out of bondage. The Egyptians themselves, they suffered judgment, and the gods they served, they were exposed and shown to be powerless before Yahweh. Well, listen, I hope this has been helpful for you, just to give you some insight as to what was going on with the Passover in Exodus 12, and then its connection with what Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 5. It's always good when we're looking at the text to look at it and look at it carefully. Don't lift a verse out of its context. Every time you do that, I assure you, you are more than likely going to misinterpret, and when you misinterpret, you will misapply. Well, if this has been helpful, would you take a moment just to hit that like button? And also, if you've not yet become a subscriber, then take a moment to hit that subscription button as well. And again, thanks for viewing this. And as I like to say, God's very best to you.